And welcome back. Here is the next step in creating clouds, or using them actually here. In the prior tutorial we saw how to create one of these clouds, and this is a very simple case because we have just one cloud image, right? Typically you'll want to have 2, 3, maybe 5, half a dozen of clouds put together into an animated brush so that you can basically see a whole collection of various different shapes here. But you know, when you have them close together like here, it still makes for a very convincing cloud layer. And what I wanted to do is show, you know, we have some incoming bad weather coming here, but on top of that we have a high-level cloud system and also a gradient. You see the sky, kind of a lightish blue going into the darker blue, and so I wanted to focus on that as well. You know, what's the tool I used to create this this cloud here in the higher altitude that seems to be lit by the sun from underneath it, and that's done with the 3D designer that we usually use for terrain, but we can also in a clever way use for something else, for something like these clouds. And then one thing you also notice here, I have sort of an alpha mask to composite the gradient with the clouds here. So let's talk about those two parts, right? So one thing is we will want to create something like this as a gradient, and also an indicator where the horizon is. And then something else we want to do is create this cloud pattern here to then basically combine them both together, right? So let's have a look at, well, the gradient, that's an easy one, right? So you basically go right here to the gradient tool, right click that, and you see the linear gradient. You can select different gradients here. There's one preset that I use, it's one of those here. And you simply make sure that the mode is opaque mode, and then you can draw that gradient whichever way you want it. If you need more leeway to go down further here because you're hitting the bottom of the screen, just make your window a little bit smaller. Use the zoom tool here to zoom out. Use the hand to move it up, and then that way you have a bit more leeway to say exactly how far you want that horizon line from the gradient to appear. And that will be our starting point for the gradient, and so make sure you store that. And so we have the gradient background there. Now we will get back to that later. Now we need to focus on this part, how to create a sky that looks about like this, right? So the way to do this in this way, in this case here, I used the 3D terrain, and in fact I started with an image that I would typically use also, such as this one here, that I would typically use for terrain modeling as an elevation map. We've used this many times. I'm going to use one of those and then go into the terrain editor, 3D transform, 3D designer, and you see it remembers my settings. It still comes up with that, but I wanted to kind of reset all that. So let's undo the let's see, get rid of the fog, get rid of well, the lighting. Usually you have your above it, right? Usually you have something like this. This is your terrain. You got some lighting, and so how do you turn this into some sort of a cloud from underneath it? Right. Well, first of all, you need to turn the terrain in such a way that you look at it from underneath, right? And then perhaps line it up like this. Set your lighting. Take the terrain elevation, the height off a little bit, right? You don't need that much. In fact, you may make it totally flat at first. But then one of the biggest steps is, you know, make sure you have some sort of a unique color, something like blue. Something like that for the blue sky, and then the fog. The ground fog is one of the big tricks on that one. So let's take the nonlinear, for instance, right? So the ground fog, normally, if you look at the terrain like this and from above it, let's go back to the normal view. There you go. You see the ground fog like this, right? This is usually where the ground fog is coming in, and all we'll do here is use that to create indeed a portion that is not going to show as the terrain, but it's going to disappear in this fog. You see this ground fog there, right? Now if you go too low, if the higher limit is below the lower limit, it will switch the other way. That's not what we want, right? We want something like this. Get the amplitude back to next to nothing. There you go. Okay, and then you can zip it over to look at it from below. And you basically have here the lighting you want, but you now need to work on where is the sun hitting it. So you have the azimuth here for the light source. You want to make sure that light is pretty reddish, if indeed it's supposed to be a sunset or something like that. I mean, you can change that lighting color, and then also the intensity as usual. You can change the scaling. You know, there's all sorts of different weather conditions or patterns you can create with that. Let's get it a little bit more reddish here. There you go. Also the zenith, all these parameters, play with those a little bit until you get the lighting the way you want it. Specular, look at that. So many different moods that you can portray with that. All right, so and then I keep adjusting the fog too, right? If you want very crisp openings in the sky, in the cloud layer here, you can do that. Or if you want a very soft transition, something like this. And then keep in mind, you can also add a little bit of shading on those clouds, but don't overdo that. Don't do too much of that. Let's see. Let's tighten this a little bit. We do want to see through that a little bit there. You might even play with some of these shadow casts, see if it's helping to cast some shadows. Probably not so much, but you never know. Maybe with anti-aliasing on the rendering pass. That's a pre-filter. There's some anti-aliasing. Maybe even with ambient occlusion. Right, a little bit of bluish haze or tint or something like that. So play with those parameters. Make sure you have your layout, your direction lined up about the way you want it. Don't sweat the fine detail. You can always crop or zoom or scale or blur it. Something like this might be just fine. Okay, all right, so there's also the second light source here. That too can be used to give some additional lighting. Maybe there's a moon. See, one thing, you might have the sun over here on the left side, and then you might have a moon somewhere here, so maybe you need some additional light in one particular corner of this sky. All right, and then render this out, and so now we have a first level of cloud, and I'll store this one. And that's similar to what I did here, right? So this is what that represents. We get a plain blue, not a gradient blue, just a plain blue sky, but we have a nice little cloud pattern that is being lit from a sun that's about to set or already set. You can always imagine later you'll be right-clicking here to add some lens flares, and that lens flare might look something like this, right? And that will add the sun that's missing right there at this place. All right, so the next thing is to say, well, how are we going to combine this with this? All right. Well, we have a blue background here. Call that a blue screen. We have here a gradient. Well, happens to be blue too, but never mind that. But the plain blue here is essentially going to be the keying indicator to combine, to pull through the image that's here. All right. So what we need to do is put this image into the swap. All right, let's go to the swap image, and we are now looking at the swap image. Let's go put this thing right in there. Go back to the main image. We are at the main image. Let's put this thing there. And so what we want to do is combine the two together. If we click on the upper right corner previews there, this upper right thumbnail will show you a combination of both, but it's in a multiply mode. But that's okay. We want to do basically the blue screen mode here. So you could right click here and look for the blue screen, right? Well, that's not exactly it, but it's getting close. So let's uncheck this and see actually under the filter what you could do is composite with swap, right, and do the blue screen compositing. Now I'm in the show matte mode here. I don't want that. I want it in the regular mode. And there you go. So that could be one way to bring things together. It gives you some additional controls. It might not be the perfect level of blending, but it's a good way to start. And the other things that you might want to do is actually have a selection mask. So let's go back to this image. That would be another technique, is to say, well, let's go and make that same blue screen that we had here. What was it? The compositing blue screen. This time, let's show the matte and basically look at this and say, well, okay, so the brighter it is, the more I want to show it through. And the darker it is, the less I want to show through, right? So that's the blending or the compositing indicator. And what you could do is simply take that, keep that, store that, and store that image. So we have here a grayscale transition mask, if you want, or transparency mask. You can store the alpha, selection, store alpha, store selection. And of course, right now there's nothing in the alpha. But what we can do is we can grab a copy into the stored copy here. We can grab whatever the current image is. So here, click Get Image. And so it puts that image here into the stored copy. And so that's a first step. And then the second step is say, take it from here and make that go into the alpha channel. So replace. So now we actually have a selection mask that came from that image. And we might adjust it a little bit, go to selection, adjust selection, make it a little bit brighter, make it a little bit less contrasty, more contrasty, so there's all sorts of additional controls. But what I'm getting to is that you have now a selection mask, not just a blue screen transition mask, but really a selection mask that you can do. Let's do a get image, or excuse me, get alpha. There it is. So that's now a stored alpha. It's much more transparent than it was before. Right. So what you could do is perhaps say, well, that's a little bit too much. Let's go back to, because you can't even see this is all lighter than 50%. So even when you replace it, you don't see the marching ants because it's all on one side of the 50%. So you might want to expand the dynamic range on that selection, and or do some more of that adjustment there, so it's not too much of one or the other. Okay, something like that will be fine. But now what I'm saying is that you can use that mask also to further restrict what is it that actually gets copied over. But if you put these colors in, and then you have the gradient over here, right? You can now, in fact, combine the two or transition from one to the other, not just by the blue screen compositing technique, but also by this one, combine with swap, using the alpha channel to indicate which one to use, to combine in between, control to prevent the clouds from disappearing as you give it the full level of gradient from the swap image. All right, and then you can clear the selection, and we are down to this. So there's a couple of techniques to combine those two, and at that point you have the clouds, the sky that you may want to use as a starting point to then go and paint over that with your additional brushes of clouds. All right, that's usually a good starting point, and then of course we want to add some lens flares with that again, and I just never get tired of that. There are so many different presets and so many more you can customize and create yourself, just adding a little bit of pizzazz there, and call it a nice little, let's get a reddish sunset here. There you go. All right, well, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.